So what are the great books and how do you begin reading them? The simple answer is that the great books are just texts that have been powerfully influential throughout human history. And for that reason, reading great books can help you understand the world better, more fully. You can understand culture. They'll also help you understand references in films and books and news articles. But most importantly, I believe, the great books will help you understand yourself. When I was a kid, I read lots of stuff. I read fantasy novels and sci-fi stuff and comic books, and I read all that stuff. And it was fun. I enjoyed it. I still enjoy it. But, not a lot of it really changed the way I looked at the world. When I read or study the great books, when I'm with my students or researching on my own, it feels as if someone is staring across the centuries directly into my soul. It is an experience that is both harrowing and comforting. It is harrowing because you feel suddenly very vulnerable that this person who lived light years away somehow knows you, maybe even better than you know yourself. But it's also weirdly comforting because maybe these thoughts that I've had, these ideas or these worries are being expressed. They're being put into words in a way I could never articulate. And so suddenly you feel like these other humans who lived maybe thousands of years ago were also thinking about all the same things that you think about and worry about. And you feel like you're part of something much bigger than yourself. And it also suggests that maybe you're not so different from other human beings. Maybe I'm not such a weirdo. So, okay, Dr. Moore, you might say, this all sounds fine, but where do I start? So often in a lot of great books courses or programs, we begin with the Greeks. And there's lots of good reasons for this, but mostly the ancient Greeks were just powerfully influential, especially if you're talking about the Western world. If you're talking about Europe, the Roman Empire, Latin-speaking people, English-speaking people, North America, the Greeks are really the starting point. The ancient Greeks have a good claim to being the inventors of democracy, and through Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they also have a good case for being the originators of Western philosophy. So if you're interested in the great books and you're wondering where to start, I would say start with the Greeks. Greek tragedy is a good place to start. You could read something by Sophocles, probably Antigone or Oedipus Rex. Both of those I think would be great places to start. Antigone is a play about a young woman whose brother has been murdered in a civil war, and the state refuses to bury his body. Consequently, she finds herself at odds with Creon, the Theban king. And that play is really about the conflict between family and the state, and about the nature of fate in human life. Oedipus Rex, you've heard this story. It's about this guy who, as a baby, was prophesied that he was going to murder his father and marry his mother. And so his parents shipped him off to get him out of here and avoid the fate. But then years later, he returns as a stranger and murders his father and marries his mother. He becomes the king of Thebes and undertakes this investigation to find out, well, who was it who killed the previous king of Thebes? Turns out it was him. And that play, I think, is about wisdom and how painful the acquisition of wisdom might be. The thing about Greek tragedies is that they're relatively short and easy to understand. So if you're just getting your feet wet reading great books, it's a good place to start. If you want to move on from there and maybe try reading some philosophy, I would say you start with Plato. Plato writes dialogues. They're kind of like conversations or a bit like plays, so they're relatively easy to understand. And many of them are relatively short, so you don't have to commit to some enormous tome. I would suggest you might begin with Plato's Apology. This is a short work about the infamous trial of Socrates, where Socrates, who is a philosopher in democratic Athens, is brought up on charges of corrupting the youth and of desecrating the gods. So Socrates gives a series of speeches defending himself, but the Athenian democratic jury convicts him, and then they sentence him to death. This is one of the foundational stories of the whole history of Western philosophy, and really is about the relationship between philosophy and politics. Does the state need to be in charge of things like religion and education? Does a democratic state need to be open to free speech and free inquiry? What does the philosophical life demand of us? Does thinking too hard about stuff just make you a menace to society? So I'll say, this stuff is relatively easy to read, and it's widely accessible, so it's easy to find. So if you want to get started reading great books, this is a good place to start. If you're really interested in this stuff, you should look around for a great books program at a college or a university. I happen to teach in one of those on Canada's East Coast at St. Thomas University. It's a beautiful campus. The people are wonderful. I'll put a link down in the description so you can check out St. Thomas and what our Great Books program is all about. But I've got a couple more recommendations if you want to go a little further in your reading. If you like drama, and particularly if you like Shakespeare, you might consider Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. This is probably the most famous non-Shakespearean Renaissance play. Marlowe's tragedy is about this scholar magician who makes a deal with the devil for unlimited power, and he's granted that power for 24 years in exchange for his immortal soul. And then Faustus makes this deal, but then weirdly he doesn't do any of the great stuff he imagines he's going to do once he has the power. He just kind of goofs around and feels guilty for a couple decades. This is, Marlowe's study of temptation and knowledge and human aspiration to power. It's really fascinating. If you like novels, then you ought to read one of the architects of the modern novel, and that's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen remains maybe the master of the novel form. Much of what we understand a novel to be and the expectations we have for novels those expectations were established in large part by Austen. Pride and Prejudice is very famous. It's a very famous love story. It's also kind of like this is the template for every romantic comedy you've ever seen. So if you want to understand where we get our ideas about romance and love and desire, character, gossip, read Pride and Prejudice. The novel features this family, the Bennet family. There are 4 daughters. Most of them are looking for a husband or a spouse, and a lot of the romantic tension in the novel is around this character, Mr. Darcy, sort of like a romantic anti-hero. Everybody loves Mr. Darcy. How could you not love Mr. Darcy? Darcy's enigmatic and prideful and maybe a little mean. And yet at the end of the novel, we get a pretty profound portrait of what true love looks like. Some of the real value of reading great books is that you get to think about these things that matter so much in your life, like love. How do you know who to love? Read Jane Austen and think about it. One more example, and again, I'm thinking here about things that are relatively short, not overly long or complex, that you can read without much of an introduction. And another text I might recommend to you is The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, written by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a black man. He was enslaved in the United States. He was born in 1818, lives until almost the end of the 19th century. And he writes this extraordinary autobiography about his experience as an enslaved person and his escape and liberation from slavery. It's an extraordinarily valuable book because we get in it a first-hand account of the terrors of slavery in the United States. But in this fascinating way, it takes us all the way back in a way. It explores some of the same themes as Plato's work, because Douglass seems to link together his actual material, physical emancipation, his physical freedom with a kind of pursuit of intellectual freedom. It's through education, his own education, his learning to read and write himself, that he sees that as a kind of vehicle by which he is able to liberate himself. So the work really interestingly links together these themes of freedom and education. And it becomes, I think, both an interrogation of the worst aspects of American history and also, maybe an examination of the potential for the American idea if realized politically. My name's Dr. Moore. I teach great books at St. Thomas University, as I mentioned. If you enjoyed this video, you can find another one over here with more reading recommendations. If you want to go from these first steps on to the next steps, you can check that out over here. Thanks very much. I will talk to you soon.